Hi, everyone, and welcome to the lecture for Unit 3. Women's claims to spiritual authority became highly contested in the Middle Ages, and the readings for this unit will reflect that struggle. I'm going to introduce you to the women from the reading, and then I'm going to give you more historical context for understanding the church hierarchy and clerical authority in the 12th and 13th centuries. So let's get into it. Okay, so first you will be reading the writings of Hildegard of Bingen, a brilliant polymath, composer, and scientist who came from an elite family in the 12th century Rhineland of Germany. So we're thinking kind of Upper Germany. Yet, despite her academic accomplishments and reputation for sanctity in her lifetime, she was excluded from the priesthood and not allowed to preach in public simply because of her gender. And basically, I'm using this to illustrate to you that all women, regardless of how much spiritual authority they took on in their communities, were excluded from the priesthood and excluded from preaching publicly in this way. By the 12th century, women's religious life was heavily mediated and monitored by priests, as you maybe can imagine just by looking at the life of Mary of Egypt. Women could take monastic vows and become nuns. They could embrace chastity and renounce marriage, but they ultimately could not disentangle their agency from the coercive influence of men altogether. Nuns depended on the clergy to mediate their access to God through the sacraments. Basically, nuns were kind of subjected to the priests just like the laity. And they had to take vows of enclosure, which meant that they couldn't physically leave their cloister or their monastery, and only priests could come inside. And so you can see they're restricted in a number of ways. Ideologically, there's restrictions because they depend on the clergy to access God in many ways, but also they're physically restricted because they're not allowed to leave and interact with their communities in the same way that priests do. So it's harder for them to build up reputations of sanctity, but they do it, and that's what this unit is all about. Hildegard claimed prophetic authority and challenged the importance of priests by writing and stressing her internal union with God. So she wrote letters, and her reputation as a prophet grew from inside of the cloister. She also wrote spiritual poems, and she had her prophetic visions recorded and written down and even illustrated into a manuscript that then she sent to Rome, and she had it circulated throughout the Rhineland. So you can see the picture here is gesturing to that. So as you will see in her writings, Hildegard subverted gender expectations by claiming that God chose her as a prophet because of her inherent weakness and inferiority as a woman. So from the day that she was born or from early in her life, Hildegard was really sick with frequent headaches and migraines. And she thought of this as actually a blessing from God because it enabled her to really look inward and meditate with God and connect with the suffering of God in particular in her moments of struggle. So she really asserts that God deliberately chose her, a woman, to be a prophet rather than a man because it demonstrates God's awesome power, right? That even the weakest, sickest, most lowly member of society, and we're really stressing some gender stereotypes here, right? But even the weakest of society could be lifted up and made into the champion of God. And so you can see how this framing of her sanctity really allowed her to circumvent her otherwise really restricted place in the church hierarchy. So as you can tell, Hildegard's writings thus fed into the contemporary understandings of women's inferiority, but she used that understanding to argue that she was in fact the perfect vessel to act as the voice of God. So I hope you enjoy her. Now let's talk a little bit about Clare. Clare of Assisi lived in the 13th century, and she likewise circumvented the traditional role of nuns in the church hierarchy by claiming a mystical internal union with God. So Clare took religious vows after listening to Francis from the previous unit preach in Assisi. And following his example, she used her humility and her imitation of Christ to demonstrate her spiritual authority to others. So Claire definitely was sick at times for frequent periods, probably because of how regularly she fasted. She was very weak. So she's tapping into that same understanding of imitating Christ through her pain and weakness as Hildegard, but she's also doing some things a little bit differently, as you'll see. So her letters fed into gender stereotypes of the loving bride who gives up everything and renounces everything and runs away to marry the bridegroom who is Christ. And Claire really promoted herself as the mystical bride of Christ in kind of similar terms to what you saw last week with Bernard. But Claire's also establishing a new model of spiritual perfection by women by insisting on living in absolute poverty like Francis of Assisi. So Hildegard is not necessarily concerned with that, but Francis and Claire are coming out of this wave of religious experimentation. And one of the central tenets of that is poverty. So we'll talk more about that in a minute. But um, in terms of her agency, Claire was also not able to travel and preach. So she wasn't able to fully imitate Francis like perhaps she would have liked. But she compromised with the papacy, right? And she took vows of strict enclosure, very much like Hildegard in that way. And so you can see her as being restricted, but also she was writing letters and she was very much interested in spreading her model of sanctity. So she became known as a saint within her lifetime. And just like with Hildegard, people would make journeys to visit her at her cloister in San Damiano, and that's in central Italy outside of Assisi. And people would request her prayers because they viewed her as a powerful intercessor and channel of God's grace. And her sisters in particular believed that she definitely was a prophet from God. And the Franciscans and early followers of Francis definitely understood her in these terms as well. So in her writings, people say that she was able to heal the sick, she was able to expel demons, she could foretell the future. So even though she's not out in the world like Mary of Egypt, she's doing something really similar. She's being described as a militant intercessor, which you can see in the image here, capable of repelling an entire army on two different occasions and protecting her community simply by praying. And because of that mystical union with God, her prayers were immediately answered. So Claire wrote her own monastic rule for women that really asserted that women could imitate Christ in the same physical terms as the Franciscans. But again, this rule really mandates that they have to do this from inside of the cloister. So in that sense, you can think of the cloister in Claire's context as sort of a designated wilderness for asceticism and for really devoting oneself to God. So despite the ways in which enclosure restricts female agency, in Claire's case, and in the case of her followers who are going after her example, it also enables women to kind of devote themselves entirely to God, very much like the desert hermits. So it could be a really powerful choice for a woman to take these vows and a way perhaps of reclaiming some sense of agency in their life through this endeavor of trying to reach spiritual perfection. Claire's rule was approved by Pope Innocent IV the day before her death in 1253. And in contrast to Hildegard, and this is really important, Claire was formally declared a saint by Pope Alexander IV just 3 years after her death. Really, really quick time period. So I hope by putting Hildegard and Claire into conversation in this unit, you can consider why Claire's model of spiritual perfection was viewed as more acceptable, basically, by the church and clerical authorities. When you read the letters of Hildegard and Claire, think about their self-presentation and the ways in which they frame their relationship with God. I also included texts that were written about them by male clerics. And so see if you can detect any tension or contrasting representations of their spirituality. Although women continued to claim sanctity and spiritual perfection and prophetic knowledge throughout the Middle Ages, particularly women from the laity. Looking at the lives of these women in the cloister allows us to see how the church really tried to control women's spirituality and maintain women's exclusion from the priesthood by relegating them into this fixed space. But at the same time, I think Hildegard and Clare are really powerful examples of how religious experimentation really enabled women to transcend those boundaries and take on agency in kind of new ways. So now I want us to look back into the past a little bit and just get more historical background and context for the way that these hierarchies are being regulated. Okay, so we hung out with Pope Gregory the Eighth last week, and we're going to hang out with him a little bit more this week and just add in more context to what's actually happening in the church hierarchy. So, although the Bishop of Rome started to refer to himself as the Pope or the Papa of Christendom in the 6th century, that's the first Gregory, Pope Gregory the Great. The Pope did not actually have any real authority outside of Rome. So, starting in the 8th century, the Bishop of Rome, or the Pope, actually got kind of involved in politics. And this was a very shrewd decision because the Pope realized that he needed some backing, basically, to maintain his control over Rome. So, the Pope formed a really close alliance with the Carolingian Emperor. And the emperors of the Carolingian Empire were likewise looking to validate themselves as rulers. So it was a very mutually beneficial arrangement. The secular rulers looked very spiritually sound and like they had the blessing of God to rule. And then in turn, the Pope receives kind of the political backing that he needs to maintain more on the ground control of papal territory. So at this time, the Bishop of Rome takes on kind of this special status and also starts to really stress the importance of the church in kind of the history of the Roman Empire. So the Pope doesn't actually have universal authority over the Western Church at this time, but the Pope starts kind of gesturing to the ways in which the Roman Empire formerly was a Christian empire through and through, and kind of idealizing returning to this past and really promoting himself as kind of the centralizing force of that restoration. However, despite these kind of ideological claims to power, the church really actually needed the military protection of the emperor to maintain this regional control. So this is a moment when the kind of ideological claims of the church are not able to be backed in very concrete ways. So it actually benefited the Carolingian Empire emperors, though, like Pepin the Short and his son Charlemagne and his son Louis the Pious, to be seen as supporters of the church. So this is when we start to see kind of more, I guess, enforcement of the authority of bishops. And so having the support of the bishops of Rome really allowed the Carolingians to expand their governance, and kind of the Carolingian emperors began to kind of regulate the bishops in the same way that they would regulate their civic administrators. So bishops became really important to the expansion and maintenance of the Carolingian Empire. And part of this kind of Carolingian Renaissance that happens is that the bishops become more educated and they become more I guess, regulated in terms of their ability to read and write, and they become really shrewd forces of civic administration in the Carolingian world. So Louis the Pious in particular defined the various roles and responsibilities of the clergy, and this effectively merged the church hierarchy into the secular hierarchy. And again, I'm just kind of gesturing to this so that you can see the ways in which bishops took on a lot of authority in their local communities. By the 9th century, the church had this really centralized hierarchy. And the Bishop of Rome, again, the Pope, is at the top. But his authority is still secondary to the emperors. And so this is because it's a spiritual authority that the Pope is holding, right? It's not a physical authority in the same way that an emperor kind of controls the aristocracy and is able to rally knights and things. But, and this is why Gregory is such an important figure, this kind of subordination of the church to the secular ruler, particular to the German emperors, this kind of arrangement becomes unstable and begins to change in the 11th century, particularly when Pope Gregory starts to gain enough popular support from the laity, and they begin to give land donations to the church. And so you can see that's what this map is showing you here. Matilda of Tuscany's land donation actually expands papal territory. As you can see on the map, it gives them more space in kind of northern Italy, and it allowed the Italian peninsula begins to kind of look like a block of cheese from this point moving forward. There's a lot of competing interests in Italy. But this is really important because the church is able now to suddenly back their territorial claims. Because Matilda controlled a large group of the aristocracy, she could summon her standing army and go to war on behalf of Pope Gregory if needed. And so this is huge. With Matilda's army, Pope Gregory was able to assert his position as the head of both the secular and the spiritual hierarchy. And he actually demands the submission of the German Emperor Henry IV. And so this is like a really big moment in church history. So I would be remiss if I didn't tell you about that. And then in 1075, he issues the Dictus Papae. And this is sort of a creed that really asserts the absolute authority of the Pope. And that is the context that sets up the Gregorian reforms. So he's got all of this political backing behind him, and he has newfound territory. And so with all of this support, that is when he begins to issue reforms of the clergy that are really meant to restore the spiritual credibility of the bishops and the priests, like we discussed last week. And so again, he's really trying to make the church hierarchy even more centralized, even more effective as administrators, and really assert to the laity why they should be looking to the church for leadership rather than to secular rulers and secular figures, right? Really asserting the centrality of the clergy to just everyday life. So all of this is to say that even when the papacy reaches its height of power in the 13th century, and they control most of Italy in theory, the church actually still struggles to maintain political control of the laity. And in particular, around the areas that they got, that the land that was donated from Matilda in northern Italy, that area is particularly contentious in the late Middle Ages. So there is still a real power struggle on the ground. People are constantly questioning where their allegiances should be, and really allying themselves with secular emperors who make a pretty good case for why they actually should be the head of both hierarchies. So the church is really involved in a power struggle on multiple levels in this moment. And so I think it's really important to have that background to understand how women then are fitting into this picture and also challenging the order of the hierarchy by creating kind of a rival spiritual authority in local communities. So following Gregory's example, the church became incredibly powerful through their political alliances. And actually, by the end of the 11th century, the church or the papacy is able to call for the First Crusade. So it's important to know that in 1099, I believe, yes, at the very end of the 11th century, at the turn of the 12th century, that is when the Crusader states are officially established, and the church has a center or control over Jerusalem. So this is a really big moment for the church that really illustrates just how powerful the papacy had become. But it also illustrates a lot of the tension that starts to arise because of the church's investment in secular affairs and in political expansion. So the church begins to use doctrine to assert their authority over secular rulers. And they do this by saying that basically these secular leaders are subordinated to the Pope because they're ultimately like members of the laity and they're dependent on the church for their access to heaven. So this is a moment in which the church starts to see itself really at odds with various rulers at various times. So also in the 12th century, we have the loss of the Crusader states as well. So by the time that Clare is alive in the 13th century, the church no longer has control over Jerusalem, and we are well into the process of trying to get it back. So there's a lot of I guess, anxiety among the laity about the fact that the church seemed to have been given divine favor, and all of the crusades seem to have been blessed because of its success. But the first crusade is really the most successful crusade, and all of the crusades thereafter start to kind of look like red flags that maybe God's favor has shifted. So there's a lot of tension surrounding the clergy and just how effectively they're regulating their communities. So I just want to stress that the clergy's spiritual authority really depended on the laity looking to them for spiritual support and recognizing their control over access to God, or rather recognizing that the clergy controlled the sacraments, and the sacraments were essential to one's connection to God's grace and ability to enter heaven. The problem with this assertion is that the sacraments being tied to their purity and to the chastity of the clergy really put a spotlight on them in terms of their everyday actions, right? So if they're meant to be super different and exceptional figures, they have to actually act different than everyday people, and they have to demonstrate to the public that they aren't actually sinful, and do actually have this control and access to God in a way that the everyday person doesn't. So basically, one major consequence of Gregory's reforms and assertion of the clergy's authority in this manner is a wave of religious experimentation from the laity in the 12th century in particular. And the laity really feel inspired, right, to develop their own personal relationship with God, to purify themselves of sin, and really to prepare for the final judgment. And again, this anxiety about sin and judgment, it's going hand in hand with the failed crusades that are going on, right? And it's going hand in hand with the church doctrine that's being put out to really affirm the importance of the clergy, and the importance of chastity and of living sin-free. But it just becomes something that is really internalized by the laity in unexpected ways. So basically, Gregory's reform movement opens up this space for criticism and more communal concerns, basically, about how the priests are living. So Gregory's effort to establish their spiritual importance to the community definitely worked. But by the 12th century, this message has been heard so many times that the laity has really internalized it and now has a much higher spiritual standard for themselves, but also for the clergy and for monks. And they suddenly have this really profound interest in cultivating their own relationship with God that doesn't need to be mediated by these outside individuals. So new forms of piety and the spiritual demands of the laity also arose in this moment because of the circulation of vernacular translations of the Gospels, which led to new ways of understanding and imitating Christ. And I really cannot overstate the importance of vernacular translations to the religious movement of the 12th and 13th centuries. Prior to the 12th century, the Bible was read in Latin at specific times during Mass, and everyday people really just didn't study the Bible like you would do today or like Christians do today. It's not that they couldn't read, people could read. It was just considered a luxury item to have a manuscript in like your private collection. Like typically these books were held in monasteries and in churches, and it just wasn't something that the everyday person had. So the lady's understanding of scripture was very filtered and really based on the teachings of the clergy. However, once we have kind of this so-called Renaissance of the 12th century, the laity gains more access to wealth. They're able to get luxury goods, and this means that they can start commissioning manuscripts with religious texts for their private devotion. So like little prayer books to use in their private time. So they can worship in their home, not just in designated spaces that are approved by the church. So lots of texts, not just the Bible, obviously, were translated into the vernacular. Lots of preachers are preaching in the vernacular. And if you don't know what that means, it just means in the everyday tongue of the people. So instead of in Latin, they're preaching in French, which is more familiar and understandable to everyday people, right? And this just makes the theology way more accessible. So the laity became more imaginative in their religious devotion, and they began to form their own understandings of Jesus's message and of his spiritual significance. And these understandings that are being developed really start to challenge the authority of the church. So in contrast to the wealth and power of the local bishops and priests, the Jesus of the Gospels embodied humility and self-denial and charity, and actually preached against secular corruption and the church being engaged in secular affairs. So lay preachers felt inspired to preach about that version of Jesus, and their sermons then inspired others to question the need for priests and the sacraments at all. So we're kind of, if you know anything about the major reforms of Luther, right, and the Reformation of the Church, we're thinking about those same ideas in the 12th century. So that should give you a sense of just how long it takes for the laity to make these spiritual demands known. But this is kind of the starting of that type of thinking and challenge to church authority. Basically, the laity felt that the papacy and the clergy were just no longer living up to the standards set by Jesus in the Gospels, and that they had become way too corrupt to actually channel God's grace. So lay preachers started to openly condemn the newfound power and massive wealth of the church. And in response to this, and mainly to the criticisms, right, the religious experimentation created anxiety, but mainly the criticisms that were spinning out from that experimentation was the problem. So the papacy then started to issue decrees that made any unlicensed preaching condemned as heresy. So now, not just women aren't allowed to preach, but only particular people who have been ordained by the church have the authority to actually speak on the Bible and to preach. So there's further restrictions put on the laity. And I could go into this all day. I'm just trying to give some examples here. But basically, you start to see religious groups that have their own distinct forms of devotion arise in areas like southern France, places that are kind of geographically separated from these centers of papal authority like Paris or Rome. And the laity in these cases is really demanding more intimate access to God on their own terms. And so the church's response then is to condemn them as heretical and regulate their private devotion, the private devotion of the laity, in even stricter, harsher terms. So this is when you start to see groups like the Waldensians, who are following lay preachers such as Waldo. I know it's very random, Waldo, but this is when the church starts to condemn those groups as heretical, and you start to see even restrictions on creation of official monastic orders altogether. So Francis of Assisi and Clare of Assisi are very, very important because the church actually approves of their orders in a moment when all other channels for lay piety are being restricted. So Francis and Clare become kind of designated channels for this lay fervor and new religious devotion, for people to go into new monastic groups, the mendicant orders, but also not actually challenge the church hierarchy by doing so. So it's really important to keep in mind that Francis and Claire's kind of religious devotion is growing out of this context. For now, I really want you to consider how Hildegard and Claire were establishing a new model of spiritual authority for women. You can see in the image of Hildegard on the left, it's an illustration from the Scivia, from her mystical visions. And in this illustration, Hildegard is receiving knowledge directly from the Holy Spirit, which you can see signified by the flames over her head. And she's communicating her vision to the scribe, which highlights how her prophetic authority actually allowed her to circumvent the traditional place of women in the church hierarchy. Hildegard, as I said, lived in the 12th century, so she's living after the First Crusade, during this moment when there's crusading going on. The church is really trying to establish its authority over secular rulers, as I mentioned, and there's just a lot of religious experimentation and tension that's happening on the ground. And you can see how the community really looked to Hildegard as a prophetic figure, and saw her perhaps as a contrast in many ways to the priesthood. Hildegard was actually known as the prophet of the Rhine in her lifetime. So although she was an abbess and she was part of the church hierarchy, her writings really echo the concerns of the laity about secular corruption. And so it follows that even though she took on this fame as a saint and this real authority in her lifetime, she wasn't actually officially declared as a saint until 2012, which is just kind of crazy. So keep that in mind. And then Claire is living in the 13th century. And this is a moment when the church is actually calling political crusades against heresy, broadly defined. The church is calling crusades against the Roman emperors and excommunicating the emperors. And there's a lot of actual fighting going on the ground in Italy as the papacy is trying to maintain their control of papal territory. So this is the context that Claire is born into and living in. And she goes from just being an everyday member of the aristocracy, an aristocratic lady, to suddenly subverting gender expectations and becoming an abbess, right? And she takes on spiritual authority like Francis in her lifetime for just how awesome her imitation of Christ is seen to be by the public. So she embraces radical poverty and she renounces social status. And in this way, she's really embracing the tropes of feminine weakness, similar to what we saw last week. But unlike Hildegard, and this is a really important point of contrast, she did not openly challenge the clergy. So you can see how her power as an intercessor really is kind of based around her identity as a nun and not necessarily her identity as an individual. So maybe keep that kind of framing in mind when you're looking at the self-presentation of Hildegard versus the self-presentation of Claire. You can see in the image here, which is from a 13th century devotional manuscript that would have been privately owned by the laity. Claire is enthroned and she's acting as a powerful intercessor, but she's also interceding for her fellow nuns, right? She's not necessarily doing something super transgressive, but at the same time, she is finding agency for herself and creating space for other women to find agency in the cloister. The kind of subversive element of this claim to prophetic authority is highlighted in this image because she's holding a monstrance. A monstrance is a devotional object that would be used by the church during Mass, and it would contain the Eucharist or the host that's used in communion. So typically, this is something that's only supposed to be touched by priests and designated spiritual authorities. But because Claire was seen as a vessel of God, she therefore had the ability to touch the monstrance, right? And as you saw in that earlier image, she uses the monstrance actually to defend her cloister from like a militant attack. So you can see kind of how she, like Hildegard, even though she's not framing herself as a rival to the priests, you can see how others maybe are seeing her that way. Even so, the church readily affirmed Claire's sanctity to the public and promoted her as a model for others, particularly stressing how chastity and total purity made her into a vessel of God. So, really framing her holiness in very normative terms. But Claire's imitation of Christ actually becomes a major point of contention moving forward because her poverty and asceticism, again, it's contrasting really sharply with the wealth of the clergy and even with the wealth of some monastic orders. So keep all of this context in mind. It's going to be interesting, I think, to compare Hildegard's claims to spiritual authority to Claire's and consider why the laity might have looked to them as for spiritual support rather than looking to the clergy. Okay, as always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, and happy reading.